as art is disappearing from the world, we're all beginning to see the emergence of a new type of interaction with the world that we all hold, mostly of apathy and of indifference. And that's sort of been the trend for the past 100 years, especially, at least since the 1950s. I think if you could pinpoint it, it would have to be especially tied with the coming of the 70s, where office work became more and more integral to our economy, to how we live as beings. And that's important because work is not just something we do for money, it's a part of the being. It's one of the most important parts of our life. Not just as how we get paid, but how we support ourselves on a fulfillment level. But since then, as we've acclimated into more office spaces and the such, we begin to see that apathy strike. And you could say maybe it has to do directly with the office space, right? Nowadays, office spaces are just rows of workers, and they're white and gray, and they're extremely utility based. So you could say that we've started to apply that into our personal hobbies and craft, such as artistry as well. But I don't think it has to go directly to the office. I think it has to do with something more integral to what makes us us. And that is how we view the product of our labor. As we have shifted further and further away from community areas and personal fulfillment third places, we get drawn more and more towards the workspace to fulfill that. But if the workspace never fulfills that, that sort of becomes the new standard. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is that as we have changed economically, our definition of our own labor and what we do with our own labor has changed. And that directly affects our artistry. And you can see that today, where art galleries are now filled with posthumous cubism and post-realism and post-contemporism and all that modern art garbage. I think you can see that especially with art like Jackson Pollock and Damien Hirst. Even if you look back at an artist such as Thomas Kincaid, back then he was touted as a great artist. I mean, obviously he is. He is technically, on a technical level, very talented. Much more talented than I probably will ever be. However, as you look at his art, you start to see something. He was the first truly commercially successful example of an artist, just an artist on the level of someone who makes pictures, right? Of an artist who changes their art to fulfill that of the new world we have come to live in. A world that values career and accomplishment, class success, money. That one's easy. Nowadays, though, I'd say I could very easily be very in over my own head in thinking this, but I think Thomas Kincaid was an awful artist. On a technical level, as someone who made pictures, yeah, he is more talented, not more talented, more skilled than I might ever be. But as an artist, he has nothing. Again, as that first example of someone who won by bending toward the order of the new world. He gave up what I feel is the most important thing in our artistry, and that has to be the human. And I'm not talking about, oh, Thomas Kincaid doesn't draw people, Damien Hirst doesn't draw people. No, that's not what I'm talking about. He gave up the true essence of art, which is to make it human. Even when he drew humans, it always had some new world meta critique. Not even a critique. This new world meta tie to it. Of course, 95% of his art was for the purpose of his business. Of course, very successful. At one point, his art was in like 5% of American homes. I could only dream of that. But then again, it's all just the same picture. Not only that, it's all the same picture without any essence behind it, except for the purpose of doing well commercially. And when he didn't care for a picture to do well commercially, that is when he would go off the rails into his political artistry. Artistry, I say. Again, pictures. Now, that was the first real example, and that was back in the 90s. Now we have stuff like Damien Hirst. We have stuff... You've probably seen it all before, but I'm not really gonna dive into all of that. I want to dive into the nature of it and kind of try to understand it as as unqualified as I am. It's at that point, the point we are at, where at least mainstream art, I am mostly talking about mainstream art, mind you, where mainstream art bends, we are at the point where mainstream art bends its knee to the quote-unquote new world order, whatever I'm saying, whatever I could dub it. But that the modern art of today in the mainstream has next to no soul. It does not maintain the human in it. And you can tell, right? Even if you are not an artist, you can obviously see the rejection of what used to make art so important. Now, you can probably tell, I think it's a tragedy we are at right now, where the mainstream has stripped artistry into imagery and attempted to bend it towards its meta purposes. But it's at that point, it's at this point, really, where we end up at a crossroads, where we can either continue to fall into that black hole and potentially never come out of it as a whole, or we can change direction. And I think the way to do anything here is to change direction. Ratatouille is a very successful movie about, and at its core it is about artistry, but I also feel like it becomes incredibly relevant as a movie, especially today, where you have the mainstream of today artistry stripping down art into its bare parts to repurpose it. Like in Ratatouille, right? Food is almost stripped down to its bare parts, repurposed to be luxury, to be marketed, to be reviewed, right? And I think that is one of the most beautiful parts about the movie in how it integrates its theme with its villain, where its villain being Anton Ego. Ego is not truly a villain in this sense. Rather, he's striving for the exact same thing as the main character, which is to finally experience true art again. To finally experience something that is real when you strip it of all of its ego, of all of its pretentiousness, of all of its meta purpose, and you toy around with it like a child again. You can end up with something that no one else could ever reproduce. With a Pollock, you have to ask, you don't look at the paint work, you don't look at the brush work to tell if something's a Pollock. No, you have to look at the... You get what I mean? You're not looking at you're not looking at the technical basis if it falls in line with what Pollock would do, right? And then tying that in with its creative integration. No. With Pollock, it's about dating strands on a canvas or something. I honestly could not fucking tell you. And what would be the purpose of seeing if a Pollock is actually a Pollock? To see how much money you could get for it. At the end of the day, you could never enjoy hanging a fake Pollock, especially knowing it is faked and someone has attempted to replicate it, not to sell it to be displayed in a home for an average person. No. To be displayed in a museum, to be displayed in the house of someone with a lot of money, right? The purpose of that art is its own pretentiousness, its own meta concept. That goes back into Ratatouille, where you have someone like the main villain. I could not remember his name, and he wants to sell the late Gusteau's foods as repackaged slop in a freezer aisle in a grocery store. And that's our human. But our rat, the supposedly disgusting and virile being attempting to create art. And it's a, when I put it like that, it's a damn odd comparison. I get that. But there is something special in that. There's something special in the rat striving for pure art, and the human striving for its commercialization, stripping it down of everything that made it true. Not good, not any sort of meta label, that made it true. So what do? There's certainly 100 answers I could give you to that question. However, I think all of them do revolve around re-sparking the human in our art. However, I'd like to be more specific on that. We have to love art again. Let me ask you this. Do you believe that when Jackson Pollock creates his 20th painting that's just streaks and colors unorganized everywhere, do you think he does a single blot of paint in that manner with a smile on his face? Do you think that he could ever experience a problem in his so-called artistry that he takes months to figure out, and the day he does, all he can do is laugh? All he can do is smile at nothing. Do you think that when Thomas Kincaid drew his 300 fantasy mystical house around a bunch of foliage with some lights and maybe a river or maybe a couple butterflies, do you think he drew anything after the 5th one with a smile on his face? Do you think that any one after the 5th one, his heart was racing, his arms felt jumpy and jittery with what he was creating, where his face would glow and someone would have to point out to him, hey, you're smiling too much, calm down, it's creepy? I cannot certainly guarantee you, but I can close to guarantee you, no. He suffered a death following abuse of alcohol and opioid for many years. Maybe, perhaps, his paintings were an escape from his own reality. But certainly that cannot be all art is. Bending to the meta or escaping our reality. That cannot be the purpose of art. Maybe in small instances, but not as an entire career. Surely not. I doubt when Damien Hirst made his so-called artwork for Drake, where he used a bunch of pregnant women emojis and colored them differently. Let me ask you this. I'll ask you the same question for a third time. Do you think he smiled at what he was creating? Do you think that his prospect of creating this lit him up with glee? It sparked true joy in him? I doubt it. I can tell you that much. I truly doubt it. Because those three so-called artists served the meta. That was the entire purpose of their careers, to serve the meta. And so, I'll ask you this. Here's a new question. How many people do you think recognize or even know the name Thomas Kincaid? And what art, so-called art, that would be attributed to? Especially someone who isn't an artist. Because you have to remember, the people who aren't artists are important to these types of image creators. They're the ones who are buying. These are the important people. Do you think that these people who were once so important to, for example, Thomas Kincaid, do you think any of them are ever going to recognize his name? No. And of course, that hypothetical feeds into another meta question, right? If your art is going to mean anything to people in the real world, which I think is a much better meta question to ask than, is my art going to be commercially successful? Is my art going to be politically useful? Is my art going to install me within the higher echelons of society? Surely, these three people did not create with love. They abandoned the human. They abandoned love for their art. And I believe that ties into what we can take away, or what we should do. Because as we move forward in our everyday life, in this world, we will undoubtedly be challenged in our love for our art. And that's expected. That's the must. That is the baseline. Because if you haven't been challenged on your love for your art, can you really love your art? So I think it becomes a point of not just leaving love for art as a side thing, but making that one of the main purposes. Intentionally loving. Love intentionally while you create your art. While you see others' art. There becomes the very important part of being intentional in loving that art. So finally, the next time you try to formulate your next art piece, the next time as you create, I beg of you, please intentionally love your art. Because at the end of the day, as artists, that is the only true thing that we can do for our art as we walk through this desolate